Hello there. So recently, this dude has started popping up in my YouTube recommendations talking about economics. And I think there's some things that he doesn't get quite right. To illustrate this, let's look at one of Gary's more recent videos. It's called Why Aren't We All Getting Rich from Compound Interest? And it's got almost 1.5 million views. Now, in my opinion, Gary gets a lot of things wrong in his video, but for starters, let's just focus on a single topic, namely the life cycle nature of savings.
So the big reason why this idea of continually compounding returns doesn't work is because it ignores what economists would call the life cycle nature of savings.
The life cycle nature of savings, or more commonly known as the life cycle hypothesis, is a tool used in economics to model the consumption behavior over a consumer's lifetime. In this model, we generally assume that a consumer's life falls into three distinct periods. First of all, his youth, in which he's not able to finance his consumption with his low income. Then his prime productive years, in which his income is high enough to not only finance his consumption, but also some additional savings. And then old age, at which point his income is too low again to finance the required consumption. The big takeaway here is that a falling level of wealth for consumers is not a negative, but it's an intended and inevitable outcome of the way the model is structured. In fact, the model is usually set up in such a way that each consumer will have a net wealth of exactly zero at the point of their death. I mention this result specifically because Gary uses this model to insinuate that this carries over to the real world and that most people actually have zero wealth at the end of their life. But I will let Gary explain it himself, so here's what he has to say about the issue.
That basically means that the actual graph of wealth over time looks quite different. So let's draw that graph again. Here's how rich you are. Here's your age. What does it really look like? Well, first of all, you don't start at zero. You start down here. You've got to pay off your mortgage. You've got to pay off your student debts. Then you start saving. Well, things happen. You have your first kid. That definitely costs you a bit. You have your second kid. Now you're making a bit more because you're old. Now you retire. Well, what happens when you retire? Suddenly you start needing this money to get you through your retirement. You start to get sick, you need a carer, you need to be in a home, and by the time you die, most people are back around zero.
Now, Gary has taken some creative liberties with the graph, but the essence remains essentially the same. Gary uses this model to argue that this is a typical outcome for most consumers when it's just obviously and plainly wrong. Now, this is also not some cutting-edge economic research. The fact that this model does not hold up in the real world is so well known, it's even got its own name, the retirement savings puzzle. Of course, it is extremely easy to verify this ourselves. The graph on screen is from the US Survey of Consumer Finances, and it shows net worth by age bracket for different survey years. If you want to have a look yourself, you can find the link in the description. The gray line represents people 75 years and up, and as you can see, they've been doing quite well when it comes to net wealth. Considering that most people in this group will have been retired for well over a decade, it is actually quite impressive that they're handily beating the 45 to 54-year-olds, which are presumably in the prime of their careers. Of course, these are all median values, so we can pretty much reject Gary's claim that most people die with zero. Now, of course, there will always remain some share of the population that dies with zero or even negative net worth, but if we think back to our model, this is not always unexpected or even a negative thing. Considering that an increasing amount of people are expected to remain childless throughout their entire life, in the US it sits at about 20% right now, it's really not unreasonable that we see some sections of the population dissaving as they enter retirement. In summary, I don't think the facts are on Gary's side here, and even if they were, this wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing by itself. And most important of all, none of this is any proof that compound interest doesn't work. Now, I don't want to misrepresent Gary by implying that this is the only point he makes in his video, but I think the others also suffered from some pretty big factual errors. This one was just the lowest hanging fruit. I might cover the others later, but they're only vaguely related to this, so adding them here would just make things confusing. Anyway, that was all. See ya.